a 6 by 9 inch piece of board here. It's actually called panel board, and I get it in 4 by 8 foot sheets, and I'll put a link below about this. It's very good to use, and it already comes with a primed surface. Anyway, this is a little portrait here of my wife Sarah and our dog Mickey, and there's the reference photo I was using for this particular painting. Just blocking in the colors right now of the hair, and I'm keeping this very loose right now. I never put in any detail, or try not to put any detail in, until way further on in the painting. Applying some skin tone here, and I'm using purple and yellow ochre for that skin tone, and that seems to work pretty good for me. Sometimes I'll put some cadmium red in that. Later on you'll see I'll have to darken this skin tone, but for right now, basically just blocking in everything, getting everything covered so my values and my colors relate to each other. That's the most important thing at this point. The large areas of painting are always the most important to get down first. That's why the blocking in process is so important. So here's the blue shirt that Sarah was wearing. So, I'm using brights for most of this painting. When I get to the small details, I'm using small pointed brushes, but right now I'm just using brights, and those are flat brushes, as you can see. So just blocking this shirt in with a solid color and creating some variations within that with some darks and lights. And these are acrylics, by the way, and these dry almost instantly, especially when using them on a masonite type board. The paint just seems to soak in very fast. So in just a matter of a minute or so, I can go back and rework these if I want to. Again, I'm using the purple and yellow ochre to create that flesh tone. And this entire painting took me just over an hour to complete. So it's rather a quick painting. It's got some detail, but a lot of the paintings I do, people assume there's more detail in there than there actually is. A lot of the detail is just suggested. Now I'm blocking in our dog Mickey, mostly a tan colored dog with some white spots. He's getting old now, so he's getting a lot of white around his nose area and muzzle. So I'm just blocking that in. And I'm applying this paint quite thin. And one reason is I don't want to lose my drawing underneath, which is a pencil drawing. So I always begin these paintings with thin applications of paint, and then as I work towards the end of the paint gets thicker. But and you've probably heard the phrase thin to thick, working thin to thick. So that's what I'm doing here. Putting in a little detail on Mickey's face, but I don't stay there very long. I'll put a little detail in here and there, and then I'll jump to another area because I want to complete this painting kind of all at once. I don't want to complete one area totally, because if I do that, and then if it doesn't relate to the rest of the painting, then I would have to change all that detail. So I work up this detail a bit at a time everywhere on the painting, so it all sort of comes out equally, if that makes any sense. Now in a second here, I'm going to pick up my atomizer and spray this portrait here with a little bit of water. That kind of lubricates that surface just enough where when I put this wet color over the dry color, it will actually make it look or appear like I'm blending those two colors together. Obviously, I can't blend a wet color into a dry color because it's dry, but by spraying that, I can sort of put this glaze over the dry paint, and it really makes it appear like those colors are blended together. And I do that all the time when I'm painting. Of course, if I were using oils, that's a whole different story. I wouldn't have to do that. Wouldn't have to spray anything because the paints stay wet for a long time. But these acrylics do dry very quickly. A lot of people do have problems with acrylics simply for that reason, but the atomizer helps so very much in solving some of those issues. Now I'm back with a slightly larger brush, working on the hair. And I've left the background white until this point, so I figured, now's the time to put in the background and get this whole portrait blocked in. So I'm using sort of a middle tone gray here because I don't want it to fight too much with the color of the hair and the shirt. So a neutral color seems to work. A lot of times it's difficult to know what color background to put in for something like this. I just sometimes try small patches of a different color. Often I'll use sort of a cool greenish color. But this gray seems to work, I think, at least for right now at this point in the painting. Sarah's hair is quite wavy, so I'm putting in some of those areas now and probably exaggerating them some from my reference photograph. Right at the top of Sarah's head, we've got some lighting that's coming from behind. So I'm putting that in now. This is, I think it's just called rim lighting, and that always, to me, adds a little bit of interest to a painting, especially if I can see it there in the reference photograph. And that's probably one of the brightest highlight accent spots of the entire painting, is where that rim lighting is. Now with a very small pointed brush, I'm putting in some details of the hair, and I'm using my hand, one hand over the other, just to steady myself, steady my brush. Often I'll use a ruler or a yardstick or something like that to do the same thing, called a maul stick. But on a small painting like this, I often just use hand over hand to steady myself. Sarah's shirt has a pattern to it, so I'm putting that in now. And I'm just using a combination of, I guess, black and some ultramarine blue to put that in because it's very dark. More rim lighting to our dog Mickey seems to be appropriate right here. And it really sort of emphasizes the edge of the dog, sort of brings it to the forefront a little bit more than it would had I not put quite as much rim lighting on there. I'm exaggerating that rim lighting some, but I don't always follow the photograph totally accurately. That's not my point. My point is to make as good a painting as I can. And so at some point I deviate from the photograph somewhat. Although in a portrait like this, I have to stay pretty close to what I'm looking at on the reference. Sometimes when I put a stroke down like this, it's just too harsh, and I'll just use my finger and soften it. A little bit of a highlight right here. Things like that have to be done very carefully and accurately, or just won't look right if it's off just a tiny bit. So now that the painting is finished to this point, the background to me looks a little weak. It's just too much the same value as the rest of the painting, and I want that rim lighting to show up, so I have chosen to darken the background. And here I'm just using black and white, and I think a little bit of a touch of ultramarine blue in that. So I'm just darkening up that background, and that brings out that rim lighting quite nicely. Towards the front of her face here, I'm keeping those edges very sharp, but when I get to the back of her head, where her hair is, I'm keeping that area very soft. So I'm leaving a little bit of that light gray, blending that in with the darker gray, just to keep that area nice and soft. Well, that finishes this little portrait of Sarah and Mickey. So I hope you enjoyed watching. Bye-bye.